We are transmitting live from San Diego, California, from the studios of KPBS on the campus of San Diego State University. It is my pleasure to welcome our experts and all our participants in Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and other countries in Latin America. We are joined today by more than 100 participating sites and many leaders of business, government, and education. Welcome to the program Modern Instructional Technology, State-of-the-Art, and Applications. This video conference is the third of 4 sessions in the 1995 series Telecommunications for Education and Professional Development. I am Dr. Michael Reel, the moderator for this video conference. This series of video conferences is designed for the non-specialist interested in using the new electronic learning technologies that are now so important to our professional success, both regionally and globally. Our certificate program offers credentials in employing today's most exciting and useful technologies. Let me remind the coordinators in each receive site to collect attendance sheets and mail them back to this university as soon as possible. Include the evaluation forms filled out by those interested in receiving the Certificate of Participation. Today's program consists of 2 presentation modules and 2 question and answer sessions. We look forward to your participation. Our topic is Modern Instructional Technology, State-of-the-Art, and Applications. How do new technologies of instruction change how we learn? What new opportunities are now available for instruction and information seeking? Our guest experts, Dr. Bernie Dodge and Mr. Jeff Smith, will answer these questions and other questions from you by phone and fax during these 2 hours. First, let us ask, why is modern instructional technology important? Haven't people who really wanted to learn always found ways to learn? Haven't there always been enough tools to make human learning possible? Well, yes and no. Dedication and motivation from teachers and learners will always be necessary. But in recent years, our situation and potential have changed tremendously. First, the technologies themselves are so much faster, they're more vivid and flexible, that they make instruction far more efficient and effective than older technologies could ever hope to. Not to employ modern instructional technologies is like trying to use a horse and buggy for space flight. Second, these technologies can actually increase learner motivation and rewards, so that not only the best students, but also the average or even slow student can be brought dynamically into the learning experience with a sense of excitement and reward. Strong students and weak students will all perform better, and it is a disservice to not make modern instructional technology available to them. Third, the content of much of what is learned today has changed. Our employees, our professional colleagues, and our students all live and work in the world of modern technology, a world of phones, faxes, computers, CDs, teleconferences, multimedia, video, and countless other technologies of communication. Professional training and education for the 21st century absolutely requires that we use new technologies, or we cannot convey the kinds of skills and understanding that are more and more part of everyday work and life in contemporary society. So we all sense that modern instructional technology provides better tools for professional training and education, that it more effectively motivates and involves the learner, and that it is a necessary part of our world today. Then how specifically might we all better employ these tools, particularly the Internet and the World Wide Web, for our own purposes? Here to answer that question and other questions are our guest experts today. Mr. Jeff Smith is president of Smith Automation Services, which provides organizations with technical, management, and marketing services for their electronic systems applications. Mr. Smith has over 30 years' experience in the development of technologies for both government and commercial applications. He has managed large projects, including a government-wide crisis information management system and a worldwide INF treaty verification network. Mr. Smith currently focuses on national research education network applications and Internet access development, including the development of a new system for print and click domain-specific access to the Internet. Dr. Bernie Dodge is an internationally recognized researcher and consultant in educational technology. Dr. Dodge is a leader in new technology models and training tools with numerous contributions in software design, teacher training, and interactive instruction for the workplace. An outstanding professor in the College of Education at San Diego State University, Dr. Dodge has a BA degree in electrical engineering and has master's and doctoral degrees in instructional design from Syracuse University. Welcome to our teleconference. It is a pleasure and honor to have you with us today. Before we begin with our first presentation module, let me ask a preliminary question. In general, what is it that makes instructional technology today different from what it was at mid-century or even 10 years ago? Bernie?
I can think of two differences. One is that the old educational media, television, radio, and film, were one-way media, and the learner was passive. Today's media are interactive. The learner has to do something in order for the lesson to progress. And the second major difference is the difficulty of production. Before, you had to be a corporation and highly skilled to produce in those media. Today, a child can produce a web page or some multimedia.
Jeff, what's your impression of the differences today?
Well, I think the primary major difference is in the developments in telecommunications, and in particular, the ability to facilitate long-distance learning. We're truly becoming a global village. And I think the other aspect of that, because of the speed of transmission now, that interactive multimedia communications over long distances can now be achieved.
We'll explore all of this further. It is apparent that even those of us with extensive experience in teaching and in technologies are constantly faced with a struggle to keep current, to make use of the best that is available. So let us turn now to Module 1, in which Dr. Bernie Dodge explains the changed nature of learning and the promise of new technologies today.
Good morning. A year ago, I had the privilege of participating in another broadcast by the International Training Center in which I described new forms of computer-based training. What made those software applications new was not any particular technological advance. Instead, it was a paradigm shift that is taking place among educators and trainers. This shift in thinking is called constructivism, and it's changing the way that many of us teach. Another development that opens up new opportunities for education is the arrival of the World Wide Web, a technology that works well with the idea of creating environments for active learning. For the next few minutes, I'd like to address these three questions. 1, what are constructivism and active learning? 2, what is the World Wide Web? And 3, how can the World Wide Web be used to bring about active learning? What is active learning? More and more educators are drawing a distinction between two fundamentally different approaches to teaching. In one, the goal is to transfer as effectively and efficiently as possible a concise and coherent block of information from the teacher or computer into the minds of learners. Most existing computer-based training for adults has been designed with knowledge transfer in mind. Extraneous information is left out, the content is simplified. The emphasis is on individual learning, and learners have a limited number of paths through the lesson. This approach works well for the training of basic skills in areas of knowledge that are well-defined and stable. For most of us, though, the world just isn't that way. As adults, we face one ill-defined problem after another. The specific facts that we have to know change so quickly that some knowledge becomes obsolete almost as soon as we master it. The knowledge transfer approach doesn't prepare us well for a messy world in constant motion. An alternative way to think about teaching and learning is called constructivism. A constructivist educator doesn't strip away the natural complexity of a subject. Instead, multiple perspectives are brought to bear. The goal of a constructivist learning environment is not the accurate transfer of content from the instructor to the learner. Instead, the learner is given tasks and opportunities, information resources and support, and is encouraged to construct their own version of the content, subject to revision through feedback. Many paths through the lesson are allowed, and collaboration with other learners is stressed over lonely, individualized learning. A constructivist use of technology presents information to the learner in multiple forms from multiple sources and invites the learner to make sense of it. The focus is on making meaning, not on memorization. The focus is on active learning. The learner can acquire the information needed from several sources via the computer and from offline sources including his or her own prior experience, from information gathered while collaborating with other learners, and from references and other sources of expertise found somewhere far away from the computer screen. In general, a constructivist approach is more learner-focused and less teacher-focused. The emphasis is on making a set of tasks and resources available to learners and creating an environment in which the learners can actively create their own meaning in that context, rather than to passively absorb knowledge structures created by the instructor. Since last year's broadcast, a new technology has grown enormously in importance and accessibility. This technology, the World Wide Web, lends itself beautifully to constructivist active learning. What is the World Wide Web? The World Wide Web is the fastest growing part of the Internet. Jeff Smith will explain shortly the history and structure of the Internet. So for now, I'll focus solely on the web. It goes without saying that technology is changing our personal and professional lives at an ever-quickening pace. I've experienced this firsthand recently. Less than 2 years ago, a colleague said to me at a conference, "Have you seen Mosaic? It's amazing." I didn't know what he was talking about, so I filed the word Mosaic in the back of my mind and resolved to look it up when I got a chance. My chance came 2 months later when I visited a colleague on another campus. He had Mosaic running on his computer, and in a matter of minutes he was showing me illustrated pages of information from all over the world. My jaw dropped. This truly was amazing. Finally, somebody had made the Internet pretty to look at and easy to use. On that day, my professional life changed direction because I could see that this was going to radically affect the way I teach and the way many of us will learn. Before we get into the educational uses of the World Wide Web, let's define some of the terms commonly used in discussing the web. Mosaic was the first of the graphical user interfaces to the World Wide Web. Later on came another program called Netscape that added more features and speed. Both Mosaic and Netscape are what are called browsers, software tools that you install on your computer that let you look at documents on the World Wide Web. Here is a typical document on the web. This web page includes graphics both as a source of information and as decoration. Notice that some of the text is underlined in purple or blue. These underlined words are called anchors or hot text. What happens when you click on an anchor? Your browser sends a request off to a distant computer asking it for information to send the information for a different page. If I had clicked on the anchor seen on the last screen, the screen would have gone blank for a moment and then very quickly changed to a new page. Each page that we're looking at resides on a computer called a server. A web server can be a personal computer or a Unix workstation. The server need not be a fast, expensive machine. In fact, I set up my first server on a 6-year-old Macintosh SE30. Setting up a server is a fairly simple task, and corporations, university departments, and even elementary schools are doing it every day. Every document on the web has an address called a URL, or Uniform Resource Locator. The URL of the page we just saw here looks fairly cryptic, but with experience you'll see some recurring patterns that will make URLs more understandable. How do you create a web page? Most of the work can be done with your word processing software. Microsoft Word, WordPerfect, and ClarisWorks all allow one to save a document as HTML, or hypertext markup language. HTML embeds special characters or tags in your document to tell your browser how to display a given word. To show the phrase San Diego in bold-faced text, for example, the HTML would simply look like this. What makes the World Wide Web especially exciting is that it also allows you to create anchors that download files for you or allow you to send email to an individual. The web thus makes it easy to gain access to data, software, and people. Having access to the World Wide Web at your business, university, or school is like suddenly having the largest library in the world move in next door to you. For many people who are new to the web, the temptation to browse and pursue one link after another is so strong that they spend countless hours glued to the screen. In an educational or training situation, however, we don't have the luxury of spending all of our time that way. As much as we value curiosity and exploration, it's necessary for us to find ways to get the greatest learning benefit from the web in the shortest possible time. In the Educational Technology Department here at San Diego State University, we've been thinking about how to do that, and one lesson format that we've developed toward that goal is called a web quest. A web quest is an activity of guided inquiry in which learners are given a task which requires internet access to complete. Web quests can be designed as short or long-term activities. The instructional goal of a short-term web quest is knowledge acquisition and integration, described as Dimension 2 in Marzano's Dimensions of Thinking model. At the end of a short-term web quest, a learner will have grappled with a significant amount of new information and made sense of it. A short-term web quest is designed to be completed in 1 to 3 class periods. The instructional goal of a longer-term web quest is what Marzano calls Dimension 3, extending and refining knowledge. After completing a longer-term web quest, a learner would have analyzed a body of knowledge deeply, transformed it in some way, and demonstrated an understanding of the material by creating something that others can respond to, online or off. A longer-term web quest will typically take between a week and a month in a classroom setting. For today, however, we'll focus on short-term web quests. Web quests of either short or long duration are deliberately designed to make the best use of a learner's time. There's questionable educational benefit in having learners surfing the net without a clear task in mind, and most educational and training institutions must ration student connect time severely. To achieve that efficiency and clarity of purpose, web quests should contain at least the following parts. 1. An introduction that sets the stage and provides some background information. 2. A task that is doable and interesting. The task could include a series of questions that must be answered, a summary to be created, a problem to be solved, a position to be formulated and defended, a creative work, or anything that requires the learners to process and transform the information that they've gathered. 3. A set of information resources needed to complete the task. Many, though not necessarily all, of the resources are embedded in the web quest document itself as anchors pointing to information on the World Wide Web. Information sources might include web documents, experts available via email or real-time conferencing, searchable databases on the net, and books and other documents physically available in the learner's setting. 4. A description of the process to follow to complete the web quest. 5. Some learning advice on how to organize the information acquired. This can take the form of guiding questions or directions to complete organizational frameworks such as timelines, concept maps, or cause and effect diagrams as described by Marzano and Clark. 6. A conclusion that summarizes what they will have accomplished or learned by completing this web quest. Some other non-critical attributes of a web quest include these. 1. Web quests are most likely to be group activities, although one could imagine solo quests that might be applicable in distance education or library settings. 2. Web quests might be enhanced by wrapping motivational elements around the basic structure by giving the learners a role to play. For example, a scientist, detective, reporter. Simulated personae to interact with via email, and a scenario to work within. For example, you've been asked by the Secretary General of the United Nations to brief him on what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa this week. 3. Web quests can be designed as interdisciplinary activities, or they can stay within a single discipline. Given that designing effective interdisciplinary instruction is more of a challenge than designing for a single content area, web quest creators should probably start with the latter until they're comfortable with the format. One example of a short-term web quest is an exercise that I gave to a class of student teachers a few months ago. My goal was to give them an understanding of how Archaeotype, a computer simulation of an archaeological dig, was conceived and implemented at 2 very different school sites. Because of hardware constraints, I couldn't actually demonstrate Archaeotype for them. That wasn't actually a problem, though, because the important thing was for them to focus on how the Archaeotype software was used, what kinds of benefits and problems were encountered, and what kinds of second-order effects it had on the teachers and the students who used it. I wanted my student teachers to get a systems view of Archaeotype, a higher-level vantage point that would be impossible for me to convey to them via a lecture. The exercise took about 2 hours and involved students working in groups to answer a series of questions. In the front of the room, there were paper copies of a part of the Archaeotype documentation. We set up a videoconferencing unit in an adjacent room through which the students could interview a California teacher who had implemented Archaeotype in his classroom. In the back of the same room was a speakerphone with which another group could interview one of the designers of Archaeotype who was at home in New York City. The WebQuest document itself was placed on the San Diego State University web server so that the students could look at it from any computer in the building. As part of that document, there were anchors that led them to a number of project reports and theoretical papers on the web. Each student team met to divide up the labor of accessing each of these resources among themselves, and then they split up. After an hour and a half, they reformed their groups, and their final task was to communicate to each other the insights that they had gathered and to teach each other so well that I could walk up to anyone in the group and elicit a complete explanation of what they learned. As an educational experience, this first web quest worked extremely well. Everyone in the class was actively engaged for those 2 hours, and each came away with a depth of understanding that I could not have given them by lecturing. Rather than to stand on center stage as the only source of information, my role instead was to walk from group to group and to serve as a learning coach. It's actually a more enjoyable role. This points up an issue that has implications for the way classrooms and labs are designed. The traditional classroom is designed with all seats facing the front of the room, which is dominated by the instructor and his blackboard or projector. A constructivist classroom has to allow students to work in groups or alone and to have access to computers and other resources in close proximity. The furniture has to be flexible enough so that the instructor, coach, and learners can move freely around without tripping over power cords and table legs. And ideally, of course, the same room should be configurable to serve in either mode, as constructivist learning environment or as knowledge transfer lecture space. Here's another example of a web quest. I teach a course on educational game design, and one of the important topics in the course is this: what makes a game fun? Why do some people love chess and hate Trivial Pursuit, while others love Trivial Pursuit and hate chess? Is it a function of their personality type, so that people who are similar in temperament are likely to enjoy the same games? My graduate students will be pursuing an answer to this question by means of a web quest. As it happens, there is a site on the World Wide Web called the Personality Index, where people who have had their personality types determined by a test have voluntarily listed themselves and set up links to their home pages. A home page on the web is a place in which you can describe yourself to the world, both in terms of professional accomplishments and leisure interests. The Personality Index will bring into my classroom this real-world data that would be too time-consuming to collect myself. In the Game Preference web quest, my students will break up into groups and analyze the home pages of the introverts and compare them to the extroverts. Are there differences in how they say they spend their leisure time? Is there a personality type that seems to spend more time on computer games? Or are there no discernible patterns that would link personality and games? Because every home page on the web includes the email address of its subject, my students will be able to send questions to individuals who have home pages as part of their data gathering and analysis. There are two important things to note about this exercise. First, I have no way of predicting what answers and generalizations my students will come up with. Because the content of the web changes daily, I'll have to give up a degree of certainty and control over this class. I believe it will be worth it, though, because of a second point. My students will be experiencing a process of making sense out of messy, natural data, a process that will lead to insights and more questions, but not statistical certainty. Regardless of the content of this exercise, the ability to grapple with ambiguity is a valuable one, and a WebQuest provides me with an easy way to bring this into my course. The WebQuest concept can be adapted to a very wide range of topics and learners. My students have developed WebQuest for early adolescence, and my colleague Tom March has created an extensive exploration of China for elementary school children. How might the concept be extended to the training of adults on the job? Dr. Roger Schenk, director of the Institute for Learning Sciences at Northwestern University, has developed a model for the design of learning environments he calls goal-based scenarios. In many ways, it is similar to the WebQuest idea. Schenk believes strongly that the best way to learn is to learn by doing, and he constructs his learning environments around the kinds of tasks that workers need to accomplish. In one scenario, for example, workers learn how to consult with the management of a hotel chain to create a new online reservation system for the chain. They spend half a week accessing hypertext materials that describe the fictitious hotel chain and its existing reservation system. They interact with instructors who play the role of the simulated client and are then coached by another instructor who gives them feedback on how they dealt with the client. The computer is used to make large amounts of reference material instantly accessible, including digitized video interviews with additional simulated hotel personnel. The only lecture that takes place is a half-hour overview on the first day. By the end of 2.5 days, they have put together a design for a new reservation system and have done so in an environment which is both realistic and educationally supportive. A company wishing to create a similar learning environment could make excellent use of the World Wide Web. Reference materials specific to the company could be placed on an in-house web server. Simulated memos and digitized audio and video could be delivered to any computer on the company's network, whenever and wherever the learner happened to be. In addition to materials prepared within the company specifically for training, the web makes the entire world available as a source of data as well. Up-to-date world news reports and stock prices are accessible from a number of sources. Weather maps, oceanographic data, seismic reports, and satellite photos are also available on the web seconds after their creation. Here is a stock price report for Teléfonos de México. The discussions that take place constantly on thousands of news groups are also accessible through the web as a source of insights into consumer preferences and strongly held opinions. An anchor can be placed on a web page that immediately calls up a form for sending email to anyone in the world who has an account, thus bringing into the training site the expertise of anyone at any distance who is willing to play that role. With this large pool of information to pull from, a creative trainer could construct learning environments that give trainees the opportunity to deal with real data and all the rich complexity that the job environment provides. For the moment, even in the developed world, access to fast internet connections is mostly limited to universities and large business sites. Homes and smaller businesses either have no internet access or their access is gained by means of a 14.4K modem. While this works well for still images and text, it is not quite adequate for the heavy use of animation, sound, and digital video. Some recent software developments, however, will allow us to work around these limitations. The latest version of HyperStudio, an inexpensive multimedia program for both the Windows and Macintosh operating systems, allows anyone, even my 7-year-old, to combine animation, QuickTime movies, music, and sound. As with the World Wide Web, HyperStudio consists of separate pages or cards of information linked together by clicking on hot text or graphics. What's new in this latest version is the ability to link pages in HyperStudio to pages on the World Wide Web. In other words, you can create sensory-rich multimedia that resides on your local machine and makes connections to it to pages to the web. When a user clicks on such a connection, the modem turns on, Netscape is launched, and the web page that is referenced appears overlaying the HyperStudio page. Here, for example, a multimedia treatment about clouds can be linked to a satellite image of the cloud cover over Latin America at this moment. This is a very exciting development because it lets us go beyond what is possible with the present telecommunications infrastructure. It's not easy to see where the rapid development of the Internet is going to take us. One thing is certain. Each week there are new sources of information and tools that have the potential to enhance learning for all of us. The first challenge facing educational institutions is to develop a usable connection to this wealth of resources, to fight the budgetary, political, and technological battles that are needed to open cyberspace up to our learners. The second challenge is a more pleasant one. It's a challenge to our imaginations. If you could open up your classroom to the world and the world to your classroom, what would you do differently? Over the next few years, most educators will need to answer that question. Personally, I'm eager to see what we come up with.
Let's begin our first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax numbers which now appear on your screen. We have 2 faxes already. The first question is from the Universidad Tecnológica in Santiago, Panama. And the question has to do with how constructivism can be implemented in Latin American universities, since the traditional educational systems tend to be more structured and predetermined in those cases.
Well, I guess there are plenty of North American schools where the structure is predetermined and highly structured, but I guess I would treat constructivism as I would any innovation. I would look for somebody who's perhaps at mid-career and is ready to take on some new ways of doing business, and I would put on a pilot project and give that person all the resources they need to try some new things, give them freedom to fail, but support them and make their successes highly visible. It's just like any other innovation.
There is an adjustment for instructors who are used to more authoritarian modes, right?
Sure. Many people were attracted to teaching because it puts you on center stage and gives you an opportunity to be the focus of attention. And constructivism doesn't lend itself as well to that. It more requires us to be coaches and mentors and to be on the side instead of in the front.
We have also a fax from Senac in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and the question concerns perspectives for reducing the gap that exists between people and the uses of telecommunication in Latin American countries through the globalization of technology. Either one of you may want to comment on that.
Well, I can respond to that. I think there's 2 technologies that are on the rise that are going to facilitate broadening the communications opportunities in Latin American countries. The first of these is fiber optic technologies, and I understand that in Mexico and in some of the other countries that fiber optics are now being placed in the ground, because the main problem has been all along is the poor cable plant in these countries, that they don't have, in effect, the wiring to support the communications that is needed. The other aspect is the advent of global cellular communication systems. These are wireless communication systems that will bring communications right down to the end users without having to rewire the country. Those are scheduled for deployment around 1997, and there's 3 major players: TRW, Motorola, and the Loral-Qualcomm joint venture. All 3 of these will be deploying low Earth orbit satellite systems, which will then allow for very low power sets to be distributed worldwide and to provide for global roaming for individuals and end users. And of course, along with those technologies, you'll be able to plug your computers directly into them.
Mm-hmm. We have a phone call from Mexico, Ciudad Victoria, the Universidad Autónoma de Tamaulipas. Welcome. Your question, please.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bernie, Taking into account Latin American idiosyncrasies oriented towards relationships and personalized attention, do you believe that long-distance education could ignore these characteristics and be incorporated into the massive Latin American educational system? Thank you.
Bernie?
I think every time a technology is taken up in a different culture, the technology is modified. We make our tools, and then our tools make us, and then we reshape our tools. I think just because something uses telecommunications does not mean that it necessarily becomes impersonal. There are hybrid ways of using telecommunications for instruction in which some of the information comes from afar, but there is a human instructor and there are the other learners who are together, and they are an important part of the equation. Also, with the technology that's just on the horizon, video conferencing that is interactive, right now I can't see you, but in the future we would be able to have this conversation and see each other, and that begins to make it seem less impersonal.
We have a live call from Veracruz, the Instituto Tecnológico de Minatitlán. Welcome. Your question, please.
Yes, my question is, what specific preparation or education does a professor need in order to use the World Wide Web?
Jeff, this is something you can get into more in the future, too.
Well, both Dr. Dodge and myself are web cruisers and web users. Mainly for professors to use the website itself, there's two distinct elements. One is a technology element, which means that you need World Wide Web software. This is known as a web browser. The software is available on the Internet in the form of shareware, and it's also distributed by various Internet carriers. Some of the software involved is made by Netscape or NetCruiser or NetManage, and of course many of you may have heard of Mosaic. The second piece has to do with how that's used in using technology such as WebQuest, and I think Dr. Dodge has maybe possibly a few comments on the WebQuest aspects of it.
The WebQuest is an idea that takes a little more time to develop, but in terms of getting teachers ready to use these things, just yesterday here on this campus, the School of Teacher Education was introduced to the World Wide Web, and in a mere 3 hours of exposure to it, they got very excited and are ready to start doing things. In terms of not just using it as a consumer, but at creating web materials, I've given workshops to my colleagues here, and it generally takes 2 2-hour sessions, and they're ready to begin to create.
We have another call from Coahuila, the Universidad Iberoamericana, Campus La Laguna in Torreón. Welcome. Your question, please.
Por favor, retírese de la pantalla. Señora, no se escucha la pregunta, por favor.
We're having a...
Is there any philosophical study regarding constructivism that has to do with John Dewey's idea regarding the reconstruction of experiences?
Constructivism isn't brand new, and a lot of what we talk about today is a rediscovery of what Dewey was saying early on in this century. One of the ideas that comes up again and again is that the best way to learn is to learn by doing. I don't think this is just another case of an educational fad going away and coming back with new terminology. We are now adding to what Dewey said, the new knowledge that we have from cognitive psychology on how people learn. But yes, there's a lot of kinship between what Dewey was saying and today's idea of constructivism.
We have a call from Rio de Janeiro, Key TV. Welcome. Your question, please.
That's okay. 1 moment, please.
Question? Your question, please go ahead.
Yes, this is Fred Lito in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Bernie Dodge. Since new communications technologies frequently turn out to be surprises, I'm wondering what he thinks the Internet may turn out to be as a surprise. For example, when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, he thought people would turn it on after dinner to hear the news.
Can you please ask the question once again?
Yes, I'm wondering if Professor Dodge thinks that there will be some new surprises coming up as use of internet becomes more prevalent in education. Yes, when Alexander Graham Bell discovered the telephone, he thought it would work like the...
Graham Bell descubrió el teléfono, pensó que se consideraría como...
It would work like the radio now works. And when Marconi discovered radio diffusion, he thought it would work like the telephone. Does Professor Dodge... Sorry, going?
Good
okay.
question.
And so I'm wondering if Dodge thinks that there's going... Yeah, I wonder if Dodge will think that there's any new surprises coming up with internet and education. He's already there.
Con el internet en la educación.
Professor Dodge.
I'm constantly surprised by what happens when you put technology in people's hands. I think it was a surprise to everyone when they discovered that what drove the initial VCR market was people's desire to have access to adult films. I think on the internet, the surprise, if I knew what was going to come, it wouldn't be a surprise, but it seems to me that the fact that people can originate their own content, that schools and children and anyone can become the publisher of what they want to put on the net, I think that adds so much randomness and uncertainty, a delightful amount, I think, that it makes the future both more interesting and unpredictable. And who knows where it will lead.
We have a call from Argentina, the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Welcome. Your question, please.
Yes, we wanted to know if the World Wide Web had information regarding such topics as economy, psychology, history, and so on.
Yes.
Yes. You can conceive of the Internet almost as a global electronic library without a librarian. There is information in fact, there's a project being sponsored by the United States government called Universal Access. And the access is provided to government information, economic development, health care, information